Get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Cary Library special program with Rick Atkinson, author and historian. We're so pleased to have you here. We're so pleased to have him here. My name is Mina Jane. I am one of the programming librarians at Cary Library. And we are here because we love history, and Rick has written some amazing books about World War II, and most recently, The British Are Coming, about Lexington to Princeton. So we hope to hear more about that. A couple things. I would like for you to ask your questions in chat and keep yourselves muted during the conversation so that we can hear each other. I'm really happy to be partnering with Lexington Historical Society for this program. Obviously, they're the perfect partner for this. If you are interested in more historical programs, check out their website. And we also have some really interesting things coming up. So make sure you check out both of our calendars. I'd like to remind you that you can still buy signed books from Politics and Prose down in DC, Rick's kind of home bookstore, and he will be signing them, not book plates, sign, and signed books are gold, so feel free to do that up to the end of today. I'd always like to thank our foundation. Your donations to the foundation make these kind of programs possible, so thank you for that, and thank you to the foundation. Now, without too much further ado, I just wanted to introduce Rick, who is a best-selling Pulitzer-Prize winning author. He has written many books, the Liberation Trilogy, which was about World War II, and the first book of the Revolution Trilogy is The British Are Coming, Lexington to Princeton, as I mentioned earlier. And that one really captured our eyes. Rick's books are always in the top 10 books taken out in Lexington. So that is another thrilling part of having him here at the library. Well, virtually at least. So without further ado, I'm going to have Rick take over.
Well, thank you, Mina. Thank you all for having me in Lexington. I'm sorry it is virtual, but I have been to Lexington a number of times. I know it's a beautiful, charming, welcoming town, and so thank you for welcoming me tonight. I'm just going to talk for a minute about how I got to this point with this book, and then we'll throw it open to your questions. The intent is to have this be a conversation, a Q&A session tonight. It's not a lecture. I don't have a lecture prepared. In 2013, I was just finishing and about to publish the third and final volume of what I call the Liberation Trilogy. It's about the American role in the liberation of Europe during World War II. It's a project that took me 15 years. And even before that third and final volume came out in 2013, I was pondering what to do next. The obvious thing would have been to pivot to the Pacific and to do for that theater what I had done for the Mediterranean and Western European theaters for World War II. But frankly, that didn't have much appeal, partly because I would have had to start World War II all over again for narrative purposes. And I couldn't shake a fascination that I've had since I was a kid, a fascination I suspect I share with some of you, and that is with our origin story, the beginning of our national narrative, and that's the American Revolution. I'm a military historian. I write about war. I've written about war as both a journalist and more recently for the last 20 years as a book author almost exclusively. So I write about the battle aspects of conflict. There's always a political backdrop to it. So I set out to do for the American Revolution, hopefully, knock wood, what I had done for World War II, and that is to tell the narrative of the revolution from beginning to end, soup to nuts. The book opens, the first volume, which was published last year, The British Are Coming, opens with an extended prologue in England in June of 1773, where the king, King George III, our last king, travels to Portsmouth on the southern coast of England for a 4-day review of the Royal Navy. Portsmouth is a very large naval base. It was then, it still is. And it was a national holiday, really, because it was precisely 10 years after Britain's victory in the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, as we call it. And it was an opportunity for the king not only to physically inspect the fleet, but also to celebrate the empire that had emerged from that British victory. 1773, the year of his visit to Portsmouth, is the year that the phrase, "the sun never sets on the British Empire," was coined, because Britain had, by virtue of its victory over France and Spain in the 7 Years' War, had gained an enormous empire, including Canada, including 500 million fertile acres west of the Appalachian Mountains in America, more sugar islands in the West Indies, parts of India, and so on. And so this was the beginning of the first British Empire. It brought with it trouble, as we well know. It brought trouble from the Americans. And of course, that's where we go through the course of this book. So we see the brewing conflict through George's eyes and through the eyes of his ministers. Lord North, who is what we would call the Prime Minister, he's the first minister at the time, and the other senior British officials who are running this empire. We see them smelling trouble across the Atlantic in America. And then chapter 1 opens in Boston in the spring of 1775, where there is indeed trouble brewing. And we will follow in this book, in this first volume, through the skirmish in Lexington, of course. Lexington happens to be in the way of Concord, which is where the British soldiers were going on the night of April 19th, 1775. And the book will take us through the 2 battles of Trenton and the Battle of Princeton, which is early January 1777. Which collectively revive American hopes that had seemed all but lost, because the British had slapped around the rebels pretty thoroughly in New York and elsewhere. And George Washington, of course, is the commander-in-chief of the army. In December of 1776, writes to his brother and says, "I think the game is pretty near up. Things were looking that dire, that dim, that hopeless." And these victories, bold victories, kind of revive American hopes. And I'm working hard on volume 2 now. It's not easy with archives and libraries and battlefields being closed. But fortunately in this house, I've got enough requisite reading to stay in quarantine for 2 years if I have to. I'd rather not. But to do the necessary requisite background work before I get out into the archives. I work in archives all around the world, at the Massachusetts State Archives and the Massachusetts Historical Society. I've mentioned being in Lexington, being in Concord, walking Battle Road. All of that is very important to me, and I need to do that for the next book, which will begin in the spring of 1777, basically where we leave off in volume 1. And I believe it's going to take us to the fall of Charleston, which happens in May of 1780. It's a terrible defeat for the American cause. More than 5,000 soldiers, the entire army surrenders in Charleston. It's a real nadir of the war for America. And it's hard to imagine in May of 1780 that, in fact, the war is less than a year and a half from being over, because, again, there's going to be a reversal of fortune. So that's where I am. It's going to be several years yet before that book comes out. I do most of the research myself. It somehow has to go through my eyes and through my brain. I don't use researchers for the most part. So it takes a while, 15 years to do the World War II trilogy. And I'm not fooling myself that this one is going to be a lot shorter. And I'm older and slower now than I was before. So I will stop there and open it up to your questions, and look forward to hearing from you. Thanks, Mina.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask really quickly before we get to patron questions or attendees. On your website, this is my favorite quote from a reviewer, Joseph Ellis, at the New York Times, from the New York Times Book Review. "It is difficult to imagine any reader putting this beguiling book down without a smile and a tear." What does that mean? Do
Uh, well, I should probably ask your audience to read Joseph Ellis's review in the New York Times. I think what he's getting at, and it was a wonderfully lovely review. He said to say that I could write is like saying that Sinatra can sing, which is a wonderful thing. I won't sing because nobody can sing like Sinatra. I think what he was getting at is that I believe in writing about war that the emotional component of war, it's about young men, and now young men and young women, dying young. It's about as emotionally fraught as life gets. And I don't sugarcoat that. It's about death. It's about violence. It's about horrible things happening and horrible people doing horrible things to others. In some cases, things they would seem to be incapable of doing. So that's a tear. It's hard not to be tearful sometimes about death and about those, particularly those. I mean, you think about those 8 dead in Lexington on April 19th, 1775. Those are sad stories. Those are tear-provoking stories. And then a smile. You know, there's a lot to be thankful for about what happens in the Revolution. There's a lot to enjoy because war is incredibly complex. It brings together all of the extraordinary components of the human experience. And that includes humor, and that includes ribald humor, and that includes camaraderie of the deepest sort that people can know, the camaraderie that blooms on battlefields. So I think that there's a moment to smile as you're reading, even about the dire things of war.
Thank you. Randy would like to know, regarding the long gray line, any updates on the class of '66?
Thank you, Randy. Well, The Long Gray Line is the first book that I wrote. It came out just over 30 years ago, and it's about the West Point class of 1966. It's a group that I got to know first as a journalist. I wrote about them in a newspaper series, and then wrote about them in book form. They're singular for a number of reasons, not least because they had more men killed in Vietnam than any other West Point class. 30 of them were killed out of a class of 579. And they were all men, because West Point at that time was all men. The first women were not admitted until the class of 1980. I stay in touch with them. For me, it was like having 579 older brothers. And I'm indebted to them for opening up their lives to me as an author. I admire them enormously. They're an interesting, unique, varied bunch. They're not made from a cookie cutter. They're as different as human beings can be. They look alike when they're all in the same uniform at West Point, but they're really quite varied. So I stay in touch with them. I mean, now they're 75, 76 years old. I think the average age is 76 now. And so those who have survived to old age, they're dying of old age. And the numbers are dwindling in the class, and the shadows are lengthening. I stay in close touch with George Crocker, who became a lieutenant general, commanded the 82nd Airborne, among other things, in a storied career. George is retired in Arkansas. I stay in touch with him. Tom Carhart, one of the other 3 main characters, lives in Massachusetts. I just heard from Tom last week. Jack Wheeler, who's the other 3rd main character. Jack was murdered, unsolved street killing in Wilmington a few years ago. So they're now grandfathers, those who are still with us, and they remain really welded together as a group. What they went through in Vietnam, what they went through first at West Point, which is its own ordeal, and then what they went through when they came back from Vietnam. The country had turned against this a group of young men who had been leaders of their generation arriving at West Point in July 1962. And by the time you've come home from your second tour in Vietnam, you're a pariah in your generation. And so trying to weather that and come to grips with that is all part of their story. And it has fused them together in a way that's very unusual and quite extraordinary.
Thank you. That certainly brings up that issue of camaraderie that you had spoken about earlier.
Yeah.
Stewart says, in the Liberation Trilogy, you explored that the American military needed to learn to hate the Germans. The issue in the Revolutionary War may be more related to the ability of the militia to stand up to regulars. Will you explore any of the psychology around that?
Oh, sure. I mean, psychology is what war is all about on various different levels. You know, as some of you certainly know, when the war began, those shots at Lexington, incidentally, the shot heard around the world, given the primitive inaccuracy of muskets, the shot heard around the world probably missed. But when the war began, there was no Continental Army per se. It was all militias and militia companies from places like Lexington and all the other towns in your vicinity. And they were organized on a colonial level, on a provincial level. They had officers, and there was a fair amount of experience, both among the officers and some of the enlisted men from the French and Indian War. And they had been drilling and preparing and secretly arming themselves and so on. So when the shooting starts, it is militia that's fighting British regulars. Now, this is probably the finest army in the world, the British Army, the Redcoats. It's certainly the greatest navy the world had ever seen, the Royal Navy. And the militia is not well equipped to fight against British regulars. There's no reason to think that they would be able to slug it out toe-to-toe in anything like a conventional fight. So, as a consequence, the Continental Army is created, sometimes by pulling militia units into what is essentially a federal force, although the federal government is really non-existent at the time. They're making this up as we go along. Washington becomes the commander-in-chief of that Continental Army, arriving in Cambridge, not far from you, in July of 1775. And Washington really has nothing good to say about militias. This is somewhat ironic because Washington's entire military experience is 5 years as a colonel in Virginia militia, always under superior British command during the 7 Years' War. It's where he learns the art of war. It's where and he's got some staggering failures, it must be said. But he believes, and there's some reason for this, that militias are not going to be sufficient, that you've got to have this federal army, a continental army that is professionalized, that has professional officers, that is largely based on the European model. And militias are to be available if and when you need them to supplement this force. This is a tension that's going to persist right through the entire 8 years of the Revolution. Washington's disdain for militias, partly because, well, if you're a militia lieutenant or a militia corporal, you might have to go home to the farm to plant your crops, or you might have to go back to the shop, or you've got other issues in your life. And so the militias are available for a very finite period. They tend not to be excessively well trained. They tend not to be excessively well armed. So Washington is going to have to recognize that, first of all, the militias are really critically important to success, to winning the war in the long run. And he's going to have to recognize that those militiamen are making enormous sacrifices on behalf of this new country, this country crying to be born, and enormous sacrifices on behalf of him to support what it is that he's trying to do as commander-in-chief. The psychology on both parts, the militia and Washington and the Continental Army, is very complex, and it goes up and down. It's a there's a love-hate relationship. The militias are important, among other things, as a kind of political police. They help in Massachusetts and elsewhere to ensure that the Tories, those who are loyal to the crown, to the king, are subjugated. And sometimes it's very, very nasty. And the militias tend to be available when you've got problems on the frontier with the Indians, or when you've got a brush fire battle where you need quick reinforcements. Militias form an important part of the overall force structure, and they play an important role. And Washington it's just going to take him a while to figure that out.
Thank you. Myra has said, I just watched the History Channel's series Washington and didn't realize what I didn't know about the Revolutionary War. Do you think the true story is being taught in schools now?
I haven't seen that History Channel thing on Washington, although I've heard it's pretty good. You know, for one thing, there's no one size fits all in schools. Some schools teach history well. Some schools, I think, teach history virtually not at all, sadly. And that's, you know, from public schools right up through universities. I think you can get a liberal arts education at some of our finer universities, some of which happen to be in Massachusetts, without ever having a history course or without ever knowing much about American history, much less world history. So my guess is that in many cases, despite the efforts of some really terrific history teachers, we fall short in the way that we learn our American history and we learn about the Revolution. You know, there's a lot to dislike about the founders. Let's acknowledge that that's, you know, part of who we are. The fine notion that all men are created equal did not, of course, apply to 500,000 black slaves. That's 1 in 5 of all souls in the 13 colonies when those fine words are written by Thomas Jefferson in 1776. And that doesn't apply to Native Americans, to women, to indigents. For the 8-year duration of the American War, those who remain loyal to their government, or even those who've got some doubts about armed rebellion against their government, are often subjected to dreadful treatment. They are oppressed. You know, they're subjected to public shaming, disenfranchisement, confiscation, beatings, torture, exile, and sometimes execution. This is a part of the nastiness of the war, and it gets nastier as it goes on. And it really is a civil war. It becomes a bloody, bloody civil war in the last several years, particularly in the South. These aspects of the war are probably not taught in detail. And you know, we're now having a reckoning with people who are on pedestals. Some people want to tear down statues of George Washington or Thomas Jefferson. We are tearing down statues of Southern generals, appropriately, in my estimation. Well, this is good. This is a conversation that we should be having. It's an ongoing conversation about what's important to us historically and what's true. Because there is historical truth. Sometimes it's hard to get at, and some we can argue about it. And sometimes we can have views that are perhaps not historically defensible, but having this conversation nationally is really vitally important. It's part of who we are. We've been doing it for 240 some years. So I think that I'm hoping that the impulse now across the nation to examine our history leads to a careful evaluation of curricula, spirited talk about who really is worthy of admiration and emulation among our forebearers, who's forgotten, who leaves no footprints. Those 500,000 black slaves, for the most part, leave very few footprints. It's hard to know who they were, what they did, what they felt. And these are things that are important to education.
Thank you. Diane asks, who do you think is the more influential, biggest contributor in the Revolutionary War? Washington for his ability to deliver victories in spite of dire circumstances, or Ben Franklin for his deft diplomacy in navigating the waters in France to provide the munitions and necessary supplies to America, which they could not have won without France's contribution?
Well, good question, Diane. That's one of those arguments we could have, for the next 240 years, and it's a good argument to have. My feeling, I love both of them personally as an author. They're great fun to write about. I live with them metaphorically every day in the same way that I lived with the likes of Dwight Eisenhower and George Patton and others writing about World War II. They have quite different spheres, as you indicate. Washington, I think, it's a cliche, but sometimes cliches are true, is the indispensable man. And he commands the indispensable institution, which is the Continental Army. Without Washington, it's very hard to see who replaces Washington if anything happens to him. Fortunately, he is extraordinarily robust. He almost never seems to even have a cold. And for 8 years, under extraordinarily trying circumstances, he stays the course. He's imperfect as a field commander. He's not a great captain, to use a term of art. He doesn't see frequently the battlefield spatially and temporally the way a great captain like Napoleon does. On the other hand, he is, with the possible exception of Dwight Eisenhower, the greatest political general we've ever had. And that means that he recognizes, first of all, he acknowledges, he invents the notion of civilian control of the military. He recognizes that's absolutely paramount in a democracy. And he spends a great deal of his time writing correspondence to not only the Continental Congress, but to state governors, to state assemblies, to local leaders. He knows that working the political levers of this country crying to be born is critically important for him to be successful as a battlefield commander, to get what he needs, what he wants, in terms of men and materiel, bullets and beans and all of that. And it's a close run thing over and over again. So, for my money, if you don't have Washington, you probably don't have success, at least by 1783. Franklin is our greatest diplomat, the greatest diplomat in our history. I mean, he kind of invents American diplomacy, and he's just fabulously good at it. Now, he's a septuagenarian. He goes to France to be essentially our man in Paris at Versailles, where Louis XVI has to be persuaded that there is a good reason for him to make common cause with rebels trying to overthrow, if not to kill, their king. This is not something that absolute monarchs normally buy into. And so Franklin is extraordinarily deft in playing the French against the British. They're hereditary enemies. They have fought several wars already in the 18th century. They're going to fight a couple more. And his extraordinarily gifted instincts for drawing the French in, as you say, to provide the manpower, the navy, the munitions that we desperately need is, it's vital. If Franklin hadn't been there, would it have happened? Probably not. Probably not as deftly as Franklin made it happen. So he's an indispensable man too on the political arenas. All I can say in resolving this, and I'm not picking one over the other because I love all my children equally, but if we don't have those two guys, the revolution becomes a whole lot harder and a whole lot more uncertain, and it's pretty uncertain even as it is.
Well, thank you. I have to think about that one. Alan asks, have you had a chance yet to research Monmouth Courthouse? Did Charles Lee deserve his fate?
Yeah, thanks, Alan. I've spent a lot of time looking at Monmouth Courthouse. For those who don't know, and this will be in volume 2, it's an important part of volume 2. The British capture Philadelphia. They leave New York with a large force and they sail up the Chesapeake Bay and they defeat Washington again, this time with Brandywine, and they take Philadelphia. And they're in Philadelphia for the winter of 77, 78, living pretty comfortably while Washington and his army is famously at Valley Forge. The British, and while this is happening, the British suffer a tremendous defeat at Saratoga, where General Burgoyne is coming south out of Canada down the Hudson River Valley. The intent is to get to Albany and hopefully to link up with the main British force in New York. Well, that doesn't happen. And in fact, that army is defeated and surrenders. And this is what will bring the French into the war. Saratoga happens in September and October of 1777. The British are just settling into Philadelphia. The French get word of this victory. It's what really propels them into deciding to take the jump. The king decides with his ministers in Versailles to take the jump and to go to war against Britain. There are other reasons besides just helping the Americans, but basically they figure the best way to stick it to the Brits is to help the Americans. And this causes the British to decide to leave Philadelphia. They don't feel that with the French coming into it and the French sending a fleet that's expected in North American waters, they leave Philadelphia and they march overland. They're going back to New York through New Jersey. And in June, late June of 1778, Washington's army meets them at Monmouth Courthouse, which is Freehold. It's the hometown of Bruce Springsteen. Before there was Bruce, there was Monmouth Courthouse. The battle is, it turns out okay for the Americans, but it's going very badly at first. And Charles Lee is a former British lieutenant colonel who has emigrated to America. He's got a fair amount of combat experience. The Americans take him into the army and he becomes Washington's number 2. He's second in command. He gets captured in New Jersey, not very far from Monmouth Courthouse, in December of 1776, just before those battles of Trenton and Princeton that I mentioned earlier. And so he's in jail in New York, and he's eventually exchanged, and he comes back to the army at Valley Forge. And at Monmouth Courthouse, Washington gives him an important role in attacking this retreating British column as they're headed to New York. Lee has problems, and Lee is accused of incompetence and cowardice, and he will be court-martialed. My feeling is, to answer your question directly, that Charles Lee gets kind of a raw deal, that he's not brilliant on the field at Monmouth Courthouse. Incidentally, it's the weather is like it is now in the Eastern Seaboard. It's torrid. It's extraordinarily hot. There are dozens of men on both sides who die of heat stroke. And so Lee gets himself into trouble. Washington comes with the main army. Lee has been in the vanguard, and Washington helps bail him out. And Lee is impertinent. He's a saucy guy in the best of times. If he had essentially acknowledged error and had thanked the commander-in-chief for helping him out, all would have been forgotten, but he doesn't. And he challenges Washington. And one thing leads to another, and he gets court-martialed. And he's essentially disgraced, and he's dismissed from the army for, it's supposed to be for a year. It turns out it's forever. He fights a duel. Incidentally, Hamilton is there at the time. John Lawrence, whose father was the president of the Continental Congress, is also one of Washington's aides. Lawrence is going to fight a duel against Charles Lee. It's all very messy. It's all it's theatrical, it's operatic. So my feeling is that Charles Lee brings his problems onto himself because he's a flawed man. But that, to some extent, he's sinned against his sinning in this case. I look forward to writing about it because it's nuanced. He's a complex character. He's a great fun to write about. He's very eccentric. I write about him in The British Are Coming because he's heroic in The British Are Coming. We see him in better days at Charleston and elsewhere. So thanks for the good question.
Thank you. Mike wants to know, what kept Washington and those around him going after suffering one defeat after another? What is your opinion on that?
Yeah, it's a good question, Mike, and people have been wondering it. Washington wondered about it. There were many dark hours for him, starting with his appearance in Cambridge in July of 1775, when he looks around and says, "This is not an army, this is a mob." And trying to make them into an army is going to be extraordinarily difficult. Trying to understand the depths of Washington's soul and his commitment to the cause is part of my job. I think part of what motivates Washington, frankly, is grievance. We talk a lot about the politics of grievance today. Well, Washington and a number of his comrades and colleagues have grievances. Washington is a very wealthy man. He's been born wealthy, and he marries the richest widow in Virginia, and Martha, and yet he feels put upon by overbearing British overlords, really political overlords. He's got ambitions to open up the West, meaning the Ohio country, and to become even richer there, and he's stymied in that by London. And so he's got a number of grievances. He has had ambitions to be an officer in the British Army, to be a regular, not a militia officer, and he's rejected twice. It eats at him. So there are grievances, and grievances can be a real propulsion system. I think more nobly, in a larger way, he is entirely committed to the things that we would hope him to be committed to, the things that he stands for historically. He believes in the future of this republic. He believes the Declaration of Independence. Now, he's a man with 300 slaves when he dies at Mount Vernon in December 1799. So you cannot square that circle morally. He is a flawed man in certain critical respects. Excuse me. But he has a belief in the future. He has a commitment to his fellow Americans. He has he's a primitive patriot. He believes in what we can become. And that keeps him going through these very dark times. He's committed to his men. He comes to recognize the sacrifice that they are making. This camaraderie that I talked about earlier is something that keeps him and others going through year after year of war and extraordinary hardship. And so, watching him come to this, to become the leader that he is going to become, for me, it's a privilege watching.
Thank you. Mary actually has a comment, which I think is important. Congratulations to Mr. Atkinson. He received in June 2020 the National Award for the Best American History Book, the National Society Daughters of the American Revolution. Thank you for keeping history alive.
Thank you, Mary. I appreciate that. The Daughters of the American Revolution normally have their annual convention at Constitution Hall here in Washington, where I live, which they own. But this year, for obvious reasons, they couldn't do it, so we did it virtually, and I'm grateful to them for the honor.
So Ken has a question that kind of dovetails into something you said in your last answer. I would like to ask your opinion on the New York Times 1619 Project, which basically states that the founders were not interested in individual liberty, but only in propagating slavery.
Yeah, and this is, thank you, Ken, this has become quite controversial. The 1619 Project, which I think was a great idea, and is to be applauded in its ambition, and it won the Pulitzer-Prize for Public Service in April. There are issues that a lot of us have with some of the assertions because it's not good history. Propagating slavery and ensuring that slavery becomes the basis for the new nation of the United States is not what the revolution was about. Now, slavery is the backdrop, and slavery is absolutely critically embedded in particularly the southern colonies and in the southern states. And slavery is a moral abomination, and slavery is the original sin, and slavery, and all of that. And there's no denying it. And we're still paying for it, and we're still trying to work our way through it. Not particularly well, I would have to say, although I think events of recent months have been heartening. But it's simply wrong. You cannot find in the historical record evidence that supports the notion that the Declaration of Independence and everything else that's associated with it, including the war itself, are simply a vehicle to try to ensure that slavery continues. For one thing, slavery is waning in a good part of the new country. There is an abolition movement that's beginning. Quakers in Philadelphia, for example, and Massachusetts. It's not that there are no slaves in Massachusetts and elsewhere in New England, but it's a diminishing number. And there is a gradual awakening to the fact that you can't square that circle. You cannot say we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, and hold 500,000 of them in bondage. So, the complexities of it are vast. The consequences of it are profound. When we talk about tears, this is one of the moments when it should move us to tears when we think about what we did as a country. But that's bad history. So that's where I am on it. And people who are more learned than I am, like Gordon Wood, the great historian at Brown University for eons now, have written about it very well in trying to lay out the historical truth behind all this.
Thank you. Nancy says, why was there so much disdain for Americans by the British? Why were their leaders so unmindful that many were veterans of fighting in something? I lost the rest of her sentence. But why were they so disdainful of Americans?
Well, they're just insufferable, aren't they? I say that as a committed Anglophile. Yeah, well, London is the center of the world in 1775. This little scattering of colonies on the fringe of the known world is, they're considered pretty inconsequential. There is a supercilious quality to the British upper classes in particular. They don't appreciate, I think, the commitment and the contribution that Americans made in the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War. I think that's probably what she's referring to. There were thousands of Americans who fought elbow to elbow, shoulder to shoulder with the British against the French in Canada, elsewhere in the French and Indian War. They're not all cut from the same cloth. Certainly, there are extraordinary political figures in London who support the American cause, or at least are against the way the British are trying to forcibly push us back into the empire in a subservient role. And these include Pitt, who was the prime minister during the 7 Years' War, who later becomes, he's elevated to the peerage, and he's Chatham. And he's a strong, powerful, somewhat eccentric voice against the government's policies. And there are a number of them, but they are definitely a minority in the House of Commons and the House of Lords. And the king and his ministers, first of all, they keep a hefty majority when it comes to issues relating to the war, and they keep this majority basically through Yorktown, which is the fall of 1781. And part of it is the fact that the king and none of his ministers have ever been to the New World. They know very little about it firsthand. They have kind of a stereotypical view of Americans, and they don't realize that for more than a century, by the time we get to 1775, really a century and a half, benign neglect on the part of Britain has led the colonies, Massachusetts first and foremost among them, to evolve their own self-governance, to have local assemblies and local councils, to make decisions about everything from taxation to whether you can keep a cow on the common. And when the British begin to impinge on this autonomy, it really grates, and it's difficult to feel that you're being pressed back into a narrower political confine. The effort to impose relatively modest taxes is something that, for the British, well, it's a pittance. It's a couple of pence. The average American was paying 25 times less than the average Briton in taxes. The British looked at this and said, "What is your problem? We've helped to protect you with our fleet, with our army. Why can't you accept this?" When there's very little effort certainly by the king and by his ministers, by his cabinet, and by the majorities in Parliament, to walk a mile in American shoes, to understand what American aspirations are. And finally, the last thing I'll say about it is no one really has the wit in 1775 to envision what will eventually become the Commonwealth, where you have disparate countries that have fundamental autonomy. They are linked together by common heritage, often a common language, some sentimental common regard for the monarchy, perhaps. But the Commonwealth is not something that's on anybody's horizon at that time. If it had been proposed in 1775, hey, Yanks, we'll give you fundamental autonomy if you'll, stick with us and have certain trading agreements, and if you'll join us in saying "God save the King," at least when you're raising a glass of ale. Well, that didn't happen. So, we can look back historically and say, why didn't they get it? But we can always do that when we're talking about history over and over and over again, and not just about the Revolution.
So true. Bob from New Jersey has an interesting question about your approach to using oral histories, like the used by Native Americans, because there's no written documentation, unlike World War II.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Bob. Even with World War II, I am wary of oral histories in the sense that if somebody's giving an oral history about something that had, let's say, the Battle of the Bulge, which was in the winter of 1944-45, And 50 or 60 or 70 years later, they are giving an oral history about what they think they remember happened then. I don't use those for the most part. I'm just skeptical of them. I do use some oral histories that were given contemporaneously. Oral histories, for example, the Army had a program, men who'd been wounded in Europe and were shipped to hospitals in Britain, gave a very sophisticated series of oral histories, which were conducted by professional historians who could ask questions and could cross-reference assertions and so on. Those are valuable, but oral histories that are given after the fact, that are not done professionally, I'm really skeptical of. Now, when you're talking about the history of, I just today finished a terrific book. See if I have it here. Yeah, I don't know what I did with it. I put it aside somewhere. It's about the Iroquois in the American Revolution. And the Iroquois, the tribes that were scattered in New York and Pennsylvania that got drawn into the Revolution, had a quite sophisticated civilization. When rebel armies went on punitive missions and saw the towns, they were invariably astonished at the sophistication of the towns, the beauty of the towns, and the fact that these savages, which is what they invariably called them, were pretty civilized, and in fact were often more affluent than their white settlers living near them. Trying to understand the Iroquois or black slaves or even women and their role in the revolution and their story. I said people don't leave footprints from many categories of our citizenry. This is an issue. Trying to understand their story and their perspective, their contribution, so that it's not just a affluent white guy's version of history. First of all, that's part of the historian's art. And it's something that particularly in the 21st century, those of us who do what I do are very cognizant of, because for a long time, it was basically rich white guys, rich white guys, having their story told over and over again in heroic terms that weren't necessarily accurate or fully accurate. So, it's something that I wrestle with every day in one form.
Okay, so Barry says, aside from Washington and Franklin, how would you rate Hamilton's role and contribution to the Revolution?
Well, he certainly generated just a work of genius from Lin-Manuel Miranda. I watched the movie version. I've seen it in New York, but I watched the movie version of it last week. And if you've not seen it, it's just breathtaking. It's so brilliant. Hamilton, you know his basic story, son of a whore, blah, 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 as the opening lines of the musical go. Hamilton is kind of a bit player initially. He's an artillery captain. He's a student at what is today Columbia University, and he gets involved in the cause when it's opening up in 1775, 76. And he's an artillery captain, and he has his moments. There's no doubt he's brave and capable as a junior officer in battle. Because he's really smart, because he's fluent in French, because he's a gifted writer. And he's got other skills too. He's good with numbers. He's graceful. He's surprisingly sophisticated for a boy from the islands. He's taken into Washington's family, as Washington called his staff, and he becomes an aide-de-camp. And this is in the spring of 1777. And Washington has an excellent eye for subordinate talent. He recognizes that a 25-year-old overweight Boston bookseller named Henry Knox will become the father of American artillery. Somehow Washington intuits that this guy has got it. He does the same thing with a somewhat moody Quaker anchor smith from Rhode Island named Nathaniel Greene, who will become one of the great military figures in American history. And so it is with Hamilton. Washington is around Hamilton enough to see that this is a guy who's, very, very useful and very loyal. This is important to Washington because there are buffeting factions that have doubts about his capability, and those aides that are close to him who are capable and are loyal to him are important. So we see Hamilton with increasing responsibilities. He's still a young pup, and he will be at Morristown in a winter that's even harsher than Valley Forge, the winter of 79-80. It's where he meets Eliza, who becomes his wife. And he has a thirst for battlefield glory. He doesn't want to just be a staff officer. And so we're going to see him at Yorktown on the battlefield, where he's quite heroic. Is he, Washington Jr.? No, he's not. He doesn't have that kind of responsibility. He doesn't have that kind of role. But he is one of a cadre of important junior officers who are critical to keeping the headquarters running and helping Washington with all the heavy burdens of command and administration and politics and all the rest of it that are a burden to Washington throughout the rest of the war. So he's an extraordinary figure, and of course he's learning as he goes, and Washington is keeping a very close eye on him, and he's going to be important to the young republic subsequently.
So I think we have time for one more question. Let's go with Diane's, who says, would you attribute Thomas Paine's common sense as the pivotal influence or tipping point that finally ignited the revolution?
No, it didn't ignite the revolution because, it's published after the war has begun. Thomas Paine, for those who don't know, he's an Englishman who has failed at everything that he's ever tried in England, including marriage twice. He'd been a stay maker. He made the stays that went into women's corsets. And he'd been a minor official, kind of customs official, and he failed at that and got sacked. And so he emigrates to America. He ends up in Philadelphia. He's deathly sick when he arrives. He's got probably typhus. But he's got a letter of recommendation from Benjamin Franklin. And, when you arrive in America and you've got talent and ambition and you're here at the right time, in the right place, well, Thomas Paine, it turns out, has a great gift for polemic. And he immediately becomes a fixture in Philadelphia newspapers, writing on all kinds of subjects and writing essays, political essays, and informational essays. And when he writes Common Sense, and he has military experience too, it should be said. He goes out and he's Nathaniel Greene's aide at one point. And during the retreat across New Jersey, he's part of that retreating, bedraggled army. But when he writes Common Sense, he doesn't ignite the revolution. He doesn't cause those patriots in Lexington to take their muskets and go out and confront the British, because Common Sense hasn't been published yet. But what he does is to articulate what for many people have been kind of an inchoate sense that, you know what, we're in this, and we're in this to the end. He dares to say that the king is a big part of the problem. That this is a revolution not only against the ministry, but it's a revolution against monarchy. And it's a revolution against this particular monarch who has been at the core of resistance to what the Americans want in their lives. And it's saucy, vibrant, extraordinarily electrifying language. It's written in relatively simple prose so that even unlettered people who can barely read can read it and understand it. It's published in a form that's easy to get access to. It's disseminated throughout the colonies almost instantly. It's like he's onto Twitter before there's Twitter, although he's much more graceful and vibrant than any person who's on Twitter that I know of. So what Paine does really is to kind of supercharge the revolution intellectually, and to state what has been somewhat inchoate in the thinking of even, smart intellectual people who read this and almost collectively say, aha, yeah, now, okay, now I get it now. I get why we're in this. I get why we're risking everything. He has articulated what I have felt in my heart somehow. So that's his great contribution. And, he will continue to write vigorously and vibrantly on behalf of the cause. And then he will go off to, other things after the revolution. He almost loses his head in the French Revolution. He's an important figure intellectually in who we become.
Wow, thank you for such a thorough answer. I want to thank you for your time. If you have any last words you'd like to tell our attendees, please, go for it.
Oh, well, thank you for spending the evening with me, Mina. Thank you for setting it up. And Sarah from the Historical Society there. I know I'm preaching to the choir when I talk to folks in Lexington and the area where you are, because you've had this beaten into you since you were wee children. But I have to say that I can't come to Lexington and stand out there where it all began and not still feel thrilled by the knowledge that great events began here, that great sacrifices were made here, and that the spirit of those times is still with us. And I think you can feel it when you stand out there, even with all the troubles that we've had, subsequently all the troubles that we've got today. We should take courage from what they did, what they gave us, and what we've been able to build on.
Wow, thank you. That is so true. And I certainly feel that when I'm down at the Common and we were talking about the statue, and you just feel that history just, running through the town. So I really appreciate that. Thank you for everybody who came. Remember, you can still buy signed books from Politics and Prose. All of the information's on the description link. And thank you to the Historical Society and the Foundation. But Rick, thank you so much for spending your hour with us. It has been thrilling and fascinating, and I feel so much smarter now.
Thank you, Mina. It's good to see you all virtually.
You too. Bye, everyone. Bye. Good night, everyone.
Bye.